Study Group. Marianne?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Gwen, it's such a pleasure to see you again. For most of us, we are very familiar with your work and the agency's work, but for those of us that are not, Gwen is the founder and director for the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. It's an energy resource program based at the University of Fairbanks, and they focus on community scale fossil and renewable alternative new energy opportunities and technologies. Prior to joining the university, Gwen worked in the private sector. Of course she did, as a design engineer and project manager. She also was involved with Bernie Carl's work at the Chena Hot Springs. So without further ado, we're all extremely interested in seeing your presentation today, Gwen, and please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marianne. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can
That's
hear
good.
you
Okay.
fine. The question is, where are you?
Well, technically, I'm actually sitting in a shipping container in a house that I'm building using all recycled materials, but the lab at ACEP is what is behind me. So, you know, it's nice to be able to choose different virtual backgrounds and have a little bit of fun like that. But I think maybe I can also shut it off, right? So there we go. So this is where I actually am. It's not nearly as exciting. But yeah, Erin warned me that this was going to be a very knowledgeable group, and it's so fun seeing a lot of names, if not faces, that I haven't interacted with for a while. So I really appreciate the opportunity, Juanetta and Marianne, to come and speak to the group here and give you guys a little bit of an update on what we're doing at ACEP, but also kind of think a little bit bigger picture about energy issues and opportunities for Alaska. And I, you know, thought maybe it might be a little bit of fun to touch on some of the things that are happening at the national level, like in Texas, and think about, you know, how that does or doesn't relate to things in Alaska. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, my presentation. All right, so let's see if I can make that full screen. Can you guys see that? See if is that full screen for you? Yes,
absolutely. That's great.
Excellent. Okay.
Actually, Gwen, you're still in. You're not in slide mode there.
Okay. I wonder if I have to share a different page then.
There you go. That looks better.
Okay. Did it work? It might just be a little bit of a delay. I'll keep that in mind. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. So do you see my presentation outline just to see, yes. Is there a lag or is that what you're seeing right now? Okay. So yeah, I'll just give you guys a little bit of an overview of ACEP. I know a lot of you guys are pretty familiar with it, but I'll give you a little bit of an update on where we are as a program right now. Talk a little bit, weave in with that, some of the things that we're doing and emerging opportunities that we see for Alaska in the energy space. Talk a little bit about grid resilience. This is something that's really been on my mind the last week as we've sort of seen some of the challenges that we've had in Texas and then like last summer in California with the wildfires there and sort of these widespread outages, and talk a little bit about how our grid is different and similar and where there's opportunities for lessons learned for some of those disruptive events. And then I just want to finish with kind of talking about where we have unique expertise and how we can leverage that expertise to you know, potentially help solve energy challenges in other markets as well. So that's sort of the general outline. So let's see, there we go. Okay, so the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, we are based at UAF. To give you a little bit of background, we were formed 12 years ago, and the concept was really to develop an energy center that was very much focused on Alaska challenges. So really kind of taking a look at not just working on energy writ large, but really what are the sort of challenges that are facing Alaskans, our industries, and our communities in the energy space. And how can we as a university address some of those challenges that are really, in some cases, pretty Alaska specific or unique to our particular energy mix. And so that was really what we did. We started up 12 years ago, as Marianne mentioned, and we've grown quite a bit. So I'm sure a lot of you are pretty aware of the budget cuts at the university, and it's been a challenging time to be a research program at the university. But one thing that was an advantage for us is we never actually had that much state funding to start with. We started out, had a lot of close partnerships with the Alaska Energy Authority, the Denali Commission, and then some federal agencies, and we've maintained that, had a pretty diverse funding portfolio. We've doubled our funding in the last 2 years, actually, in terms of our funded research. We have 45 researchers that are part of ACEP right now. And so we're doing pretty well, because this is a topic and an area of interest, and there's a lot of exciting things happening. So we are very applied energy research focused. We are largely, I used to say we're engineering, we're mostly engineers, but that's actually not really true. We have a really multidisciplinary team with social scientists, economists. We have various resource people, and then quite a few engineers that work with us. And we're both interested in putting information out so decision makers in Alaska, whether that's an individual homeowner, a community member, a utility manager, a legislator, can make good decisions about our energy choices in the future. And we're also doing, quite a bit with some commercialization. I'll touch on that a little bit too. So we have a pretty diverse portfolio of projects that we work on. We think quite a bit. We're pretty targeted in terms of the areas that we do work on. We're really looking for some sort of a broader need or opportunity in Alaska, but these are some areas that we really focus on. Power systems integration is our biggest kind of flagship program. We work a lot on river and ocean energy. That's one of our older programs that we've been doing for quite a while, and we really have a pretty global reputation in that space. Solar energy is something that we have more recently really spun up as a research thrust. For a long time, we sort of viewed that as a commercial technology, but we've recognized that there really are some unique challenges to really seeing broader uptake for solar energy, especially at high latitudes. And so we've been working in that space. And then there's some other examples here as well. And we do work on a statewide basis. We have an office in Anchorage that we have 7 people that work in. We have UAA faculty that affiliate with our program. We're a pretty dynamic research group that basically pulls in people that have specific skills or interests that are relevant to energy challenges in Alaska, and can pull them in for individual projects, or they work with us, across their entire spectrum of research that they do. So we have these test sites I mentioned. I'll talk a little bit about our power systems integration test lab at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And then we have a solar test site and a hydrokinetic test site that allows us to sort of test different technologies and strategies for deploying energy technologies in the state. And for us, the impact that we have in Alaska is more important to us than the amount of grants that we receive or papers that we publish. We're really trying to make a difference in the state. So that's a pretty big deal to us philosophically. So our lab is something that some of you are familiar with. And so the idea here is that we really want to harden and test both technologies and strategies for energy systems before deploying them in remote locations. And so this is an example here with a remote mine site, Raglan Mine in northern Quebec, actually, where we sort of worked to package and demonstrate a flywheel inverter combination in our lab prior to deployment at this remote mine site, because we cannot afford to see failures in the field, especially when you're looking at mining, but in our rural communities as well. So the idea here is that we can test either new technologies or technologies that haven't really just been tested in Alaska, sort of like the kind of context that we deploy systems in, or the way that we use and operate our power systems. On this slide, you can see the Office of Naval Research logo here. They are a major sponsor of a lot of the research we do, and we do that in collaboration with a number of other organizations in Alaska, including Renewable Energy Alaska Project on the education side, Launch Alaska on sort of the supporting innovative small industries that have technologies that are of relevance to the Alaska market, the Office of Intellectual Property and Commercialization, where we're really trying to create a culture of innovation at the university and push technology out from the university into the private sector where it can actually be used to make a difference in people's lives. And then the Business Enterprise Institute, also at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. And so this is a major multi-year initiative, the Alaska Regional Collaboration for Technology Innovation, that we are working with the Office of Naval Research on. And the reason why they're interested in working in Alaska is because a lot of their deployments around the world also deal with these sort of individual, remote, isolated power grid issues, including ships, right? In a way, a ship is a small, independent grid, microgrid in and of itself. And so they're pretty interested in some of the leadership that Alaska and some of the inroads that we're making and some of the technologies and strategies that we're testing up here. So that's the link there. I mentioned hydrokinetics in our test site in Nenana. We have tested a number of different technologies in the river there. We've addressed issues like debris coming down the river and how to divert that debris. We've done a lot of work with fish studies. I mentioned we're a very interdisciplinary team. We work very closely with the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences, looking at impacts potentially on fish, both out-migrating smolt and returning salmon. So that's something that's a major research emphasis for us, because taking advantage of our water resources in rivers and along the coast is a major opportunity for Alaska, because most of our communities are located along some sort of water body in the state. And so if you can take advantage of that, that would be a good thing. And we actually recently just received, we're the lead on a ARPA-E, Advanced Research Projects Agency for Department of Energy Award, which are very well sought after awards, very competitive for actually testing and developing a new type of hydrokinetic device that is more debris resistant and maybe more appropriate for Alaska waterways. I mentioned solar energy is another area that I know many of you have actually collaborated with ACEP on. For a while, we actually resisted having this be a research thrust, but our lead researcher in Anchorage, Erin Whitney, convinced me that there are a lot of interesting research questions and opportunities to try to reduce the cost and streamline deployment of solar energy in Alaska. And so this has been something that we've been working really closely with developers and communities on in Alaska. We are also testing new types of panels. In particular, we have the solar PV test site in collaboration with Sandia National Lab. We bring in and share expertise with national labs pretty frequently. They're a big resource for us. And so this is an example where we're testing some bifacial arrays and looking at different deployments of those. Other things that we've been doing here is like looking at different coatings potentially for snow shedding and things like that. So there's a lot of areas where there's research that we can do to support improved performance and broader deployment of solar energy systems in Alaska. And this is something that's growing quite a bit. So utilities are also interested in thinking about how they can manage increased distributed, I have the word pretty written wrong there, but generation in the state, and a lot of that is really solar energy. And so then that's where we also bring in partners like Hawaii. They're really moving toward 100% renewable energy targets. A lot of that will be distributed solar. So we have opportunities to learn lessons here in Alaska from some of these other markets that we have, that we regularly interact with from a research standpoint. Beneficial electrification is one of our new areas of emphasis, and this sort of covers a lot of different things. But basically, we are becoming a more and more electrified society. Great word, but we certainly rely on electric power to a high degree today, and in ways that we haven't in the past. And that's where you see, when you have disruptions to that supply, that it really impacts like almost every single part of society heating, food, transportation. You know, it's not just about whether your lights are coming on, right? And so we are expecting that is going to continue to increase. And so this is an area where ACEP is trying to get ahead of the curve and understand what this means for Alaska, both in terms of potential impacts to the grid. So our utilities are sort of prepared for this evolution, and also where there's real opportunities for consumers for greater cost savings. So I'll give a couple examples. Like I mentioned, we've got projects really going on all over the state. And so in Cake, we're working with the utility there, Inside Passage Electric Cooperative, the cooperative utility there that serves 4 different communities in the Southeast region, to really understand what heat pumps and installation of air source heat pumps might mean for their residences, and what it might mean for their particular, like their long-term sales, and how to sort of organize their rates to consider adding, you know, a differential rate structure, something like that, to both incentivize customers and at the same time figure out ways that they're able to make it work for them as well. And so that's something that we've been working with them on. Matanuska Electric Association, we're working with them on some end of line issues and looking at sort of what they would call a non-wire solution. In this case, you know, they are having some reliability issues at the ends of their transmission lines, especially up in the Talkeetna area. So are there ways that we can use non-wire solutions, so not installing a new transmission line, which comes with high cost, to firm up that grid and provide more reliable service through kind of local generation that can sort of support the grid locally, rather than just relying on this long transmission feeder that sometimes has issues with reliability. Another example here is we're working with Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, a big and often to incorporating renewables at a site like, for example, that MEA site would be to increase or add some sort of storage component to that, some sort of a battery or other type of storage that you can kind of ride through either changes in the load or changes in the generation source and provide consistent power output. And so one of the issues is that energy storage is a very expensive component of these energy systems. And so to the extent that we can minimize the size of the storage and therefore the cost of installing it, while making sure that it actually accomplishes all the goals we have for it, that it can provide all the services that we're expecting of it for a particular site, is pretty important. So you want to really get that right sized storage solution to keep costs down, but make sure that you're getting the most economic bang for your buck out of these sorts of systems. And so that's a big one. We've developed a in-house software called MyGrids that we can use. It's actually freely available on the web, but it's really about sort of this right sizing of solutions, especially for more remote areas of our grid and for our Alaska communities. So this is a project with Alaska Village Electric Cooperative. We're actually going to, after sizing that and specifying that particular storage solution, the goal is to purchase that and install it in St. Mary's, which is intertied to Mountain Village, and kind of provide this solution. It's allowing them to install a larger wind turbine, which they've already done, 900 kilowatts, which isn't actually big by national standards, but you get better economies of scale if you can install larger systems and serve 2 communities rather than separate systems serving individual communities. So we're really looking at the economics of these systems. Also working in Kotzebue to understand whether air source heat pumps might work there. Again, people are looking at alternative heating just as much as they're looking for new opportunities with electric power use. So this is something that we are actually using a device that ACEP developed to non-invasively measure fuel oil consumption in individual households, so we can get a better grasp of heat data and understand how people are actually using heat. They're heating oil devices in different parts of Alaska. We've deployed these in Fairbanks, Tanana, and Kotzebue to date. And in this case, it's a partnership with the Northwest Arctic Borough and Kotzebue Electric Association, the National Science Foundation, and the Office of Naval Research to really look at whether these air source heat pumps actually save residents money in this kind of a cold Arctic environment. We are very much thinking about energy from a holistic standpoint. So I just discussed how we think about energy, not just from electric power, but from heating as well. Beneficial electrification sort of spans everything from electric vehicles to all the different ways that we might be using electric power in the future. And in this case, we're also looking at food. So kind of taking a look at how food kind of combines with these other areas like food, energy, water, and how we can make sure that communities are sustainable in terms of these different types of things that we all kind of need to survive and thrive. And so in this case, we're looking at how food and energy systems are sort of intertwined. Like one example from Tanana would be that we have found through our research that people that are collecting firewood to support the local biomass energy system that they have there for the school and the other community buildings harvest twice as much, also harvest twice as much they have twice as high of a subsistence harvest on a per pound basis. And so that's pretty interesting to understand, like, what is supporting the other activity, right? And so we're trying to understand that. How can we support traditional lifestyles through energy projects? And in Congiganak here, the wind project has offset folks' heating oil bills to the extent that the residents say that they're able to purchase more fuel for subsistence harvest activities because they're spending less on heating oil, for example. I mentioned this PUMA, this pump monitoring apparatus device, which is for measuring fuel oil non-invasively. So it's not connected by wire or to the fuel line at all. So it's a non-invasive measuring device. And then we also have this ORCA, this on-site remote collection and acquisition for remote power data. Both of these had a high degree of student involvement in these projects, and they represented gaps in terms of the technology that was available for answering the questions that we were trying to answer. And for the ORCA in particular, we're looking at power quality and outage data in these communities to try to understand how devices that require, a lot of our new power electronic devices require very reliable power. Where we have sort of fluctuations in power quality, we're interested in understanding that and how that could impact device performance. So a few other emerging technology areas. We've been doing quite a bit to focus on small nuclear reactor technologies recently because there is quite a bit of interest in this area in Alaska right now. And so last year we were asked by the legislature, by the Alaska State Legislature, to look at small microreactor technologies. We had done a similar report for them a decade ago, so this was a bit of an update. This report is available on our website for download, but basically it's pretty interesting because you have these systems up here that are slightly larger. Many of you may have heard of this NuScale system, which is designed to be installed in series of 6 or 12 units. The idea being that you have this small system that has less nuclear material in any one place, and you can have more inherent safety features associated with that. Like, for example, really passive safety control. So if there's like some unexpected shutdown, that the system, there can't be a runaway reaction. You know, so there's different things like that that make small reactor technologies of real interest at the national level to replace sort of legacy gigawatt scale reactors that we have in this country and in other places in the world that do have safety risks associated with it. But the thing that's also exciting for Alaska of interest is that there's these really tiny, like 1 to 10 megawatt reactor technologies that are starting to be developed. And these are more along the lines of like a nuclear battery, where they would be deployed in a remote location, probably placed underground. And the idea would be at the end of life, after 10 years or so, 20 years, that it would be dug up and the entire reactor would be returned to the manufacturer and then replaced with a new one. So it's almost like a battery that provides both heat and electric power. This is not something anyone has going to be buying off the shelf tomorrow. There is likely to be some demonstration projects of these sorts of small systems in the next few years, and potentially even at a military base in Alaska. But this is something that we want to keep an eye on, and we want to make sure that we're raising questions that Alaskans have or concerns that Alaskans have to the national level, so that those can be considered as part of the national discourse as this technology moves along, and as you're seeing it move through licensing processes like through the nuclear regulation. So again, these microreactors are very, very different than what our traditional nuclear technologies have looked like. And like I said, if anyone's interested in this, we have a pretty current report on that available on our website. Transmission is another area where we have an opportunity to reduce costs and find new strategies for potentially intertying communities or remote locations. The Alaska Village Electric Cooperative has been a real leader in kind of pursuing this sort of strategy as a cost savings means. And so this is something that we are looking to our international partners, and in this case, Canada has actually done quite a lot in this space, as well as Australia, and both also have remote areas and remote communities. And so this is an example of a project up in Northern Ontario. It's a fiber optics extension where they I think deployed 900 miles of cable in just one season over tundra and sensitive wetlands using these this wetlands equipment. And so we're looking at whether these are sort of opportunities or options for Alaska that could potentially significantly decrease costs of deploying technology and connecting remote locations to a central grid. We work with students a lot. Summer intern program is a pretty big deal to us. We want to make sure that we are training that next generation of Alaskans in particular to take jobs in this industry. And we're really proud to say that a very high proportion of our former students that have worked with us on research are still working in energy, and most of them are still working in Alaska, which is fantastic. I mentioned our international work. This is just one example. It's a bit of a messy slide, but it's working with researchers across the Arctic, universities, really looking at some of the socio-economic issues related to remote energy and renewable energy development and deployment in especially Indigenous communities. And so this is a partnership both between UAA, UAF, University of Saskatchewan is the lead. The Government of Canada is largely funding this, and then with several European universities as well. And in that same vein, the Arctic Remote Energy Networks Academy is another way that we're working to connect people that are potentially project champions in different areas to give them the information they need to make good decisions and avoid making similar mistakes that have been made in the past in other places wherever that is possible. ACEP holds a lot of workshops. So if you are interested again in kind of connecting in, and I know many of you already are, but we do have a weekly newsletter, online newsletter that goes out. Please email me or sign up for that. There's a pretty easy to find link on our website, but we host pretty regular workshops. This is an example of one that we did recently on electric vehicles. And we also have quite a few, we've really spun up a storytelling initiative because we believe that people communicate best through telling stories. And so not just stories about our research, but we find a lot of the communities and people that we work with are very inspiring in terms of what they're doing. Alaskans are very innovative, creative, and hardworking. And so there's a lot of great little short videos that actually a couple of these look kind of long, but most of them are very short, like 5 minutes or less, on energy stories from across Alaska. And again, not necessarily highlighting our research, but just telling the story in the voice of the people that are doing that work. And so that's, I think, a pretty exciting communication tool that we've been working on. So I'm going to just check the time here. I tend to ramble on sometimes, and I really want to chat a little bit about how we're different from Texas and grid resilience issues. Marianne, do you want me to take a pause here and answer questions, or should I just push on?
No, I think let's get your message out, because once the questions start, you'll end up inundated. So I can't
Yeah.
wait to hear how we're not Texas. So
Yes,
please
we're
go
not
ahead.
Texas. Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. I'm sure all of you, because you're interested in energy, have been following the crazy circumstances in Texas. And so it's really made me think a lot about what has happened there and sort of these unexpected kinds of events that we see happening maybe more frequently, especially weather-related events, and how it can really kind of bring our society down to its knees and really, be almost be a life and safety issue. And certainly in the Arctic, we're not immune from that piece of it. And so what I wanted to just kind of share is like sort of a perspective from way up high, like in outer space, and looking at the Earth at night. And this is kind of a picture that I think shows the North American electric grid really well. And as much as we've been hearing that Texas isn't connected with other places, that's not entirely true. ERCOT does operate independently, but a lot of that has to do with power sales agreements and things like that. Texas has been a little bit of this isolated island, but our grid is very much connected from coast to coast. And some people would call the North American electric grid actually like the largest machine ever developed by mankind, right? And that's a pretty interesting thought. It's the largest and most complex, probably, machine ever developed by mankind. But when we think about it, it's really large parts of it were built a generation or two ago, right? And it's dealing with issues today or having to address changes in the way that we're producing and using power that were not anticipated when the overall architecture of this system was originally developed. And so when you think about the grid at this like really high level, it basically includes generation sources. So our power plants, whether those are renewable or whether those are fossil energy loads. So our customers, these different nodes that you see. And then this transmission and distribution network that kind of runs across the country, noting that it sort of peters out in the north, of course, right? So we'll talk about that in a minute here. But what we're seeing now is there's a lot more gray area, right? Like all of a sudden now our customers, many customers are also becoming generation sources, right? Power isn't just flowing one direction from power plants to passive consumers on the other end. All of a sudden now you've got the consumers that are actually getting in the production market and they're putting power onto the grid, and power is flowing two directions, and it becomes vastly more complicated, and it can create challenges depending on how we look at it. But I think there's some really cool opportunities for how the grid will evolve in the future and where Alaska kind of stands in that evolution that I want to talk about. Another piece of that sort of gray area, and this is the last slide I threw in here, so I don't want to spend too much time on it if it's not like super clear right away. But basically, a lot of our generation sources from our traditional power plants, they have lots of rotating inertia, a lot of mass associated with it. And the way they react when you have like a grid outage or unexpected events is pretty predictable. They follow the normal laws of physics that we're all used to. And in this case, it's like represented by these balls that would drop if you cut a string or something like that. But we have more and more of these converter dominated power systems. So renewable energy that is different in that it's based on power electronics. And so the way that those systems react when there are these outages is different and not necessarily as predictable than these like traditional power generation sources, because they're governed by different laws of physics, essentially at different scales. They're at different time scales. They react much, much more quickly. And so that could be a good thing, or that could actually create challenges, to how we're operating our grid and grid stability. So what happens when stuff goes wrong, right? So of course, utilities tend to be pretty conservative entities, and we really probably want them to be, right? We want our utilities to be conservative entities because we really care about reliable power, right? We want to know that the lights are going to come on when we flick the switch 99.5 times out of 100 or more, right? And if there's an outage, though, we actually, more than having, and this is maybe Gwen's perspective, but more than having reliable power, We actually really care about resilient power systems, and they are not the same thing. I think a lot of times people think of those words as like synonymous, or they use them in the same sentence, like resilient and reliable, right? But I want to kind of break that up, because Texas actually had a very reliable power system. They didn't have a lot of outages. Actually, if anything, that's why homeowners were so unprepared when the power went out for a long period of time, because they generally have access to very reliable power. What Texas had not invested in is a resilient power system, right? And so when the lights went out, when there was an outage, they were not able to get it back online quickly, right? And so they were lacking a resilient power system. And so I think that kind of thinking about things that way, and I'll bring that to kind of Alaska here in a minute, is important. Resilient power systems cost more money, okay? Whether that means that you're preparing for more events, right? Like I think we know that a lot of the issues with the outages in Texas were very much related to things freezing up. You know, their power plants are outdoors. Yes, because their biggest challenge is heat management in the summer, right? They need to figure out how to cool these systems much more than keep them warm, right? So they were not really prepared for this level of, like, you know, our whatever polar vortex getting pushed down to Texas, right? And they were not ready for that, and it caused major infrastructure challenges. And so their sources, and, you know, to some extent too, the gas supply itself, right, that powered some of those generation sources and heating devices and stuff like that. So that was their big challenge. They didn't have a major disruption to transmission. Okay, California wildfires last summer, it was totally different. There it was largely related to transmission, not necessarily failures, but where the utility was actually actively de-energizing the transmission network to certain areas because it was actually causing some of these fires, right? And so that was an issue related to transmission. Again, you've got users at the other end of that transmission line that then don't have electric power, and they're not used to those sorts of circumstances, right? And a lot of these are, you could say this is predictable, it's a 100-year event or whatever, but we've become so reliant on electric power that these disruptions become huge social challenges for us. And so it's something that we need to think about. Paying for more resilient power systems, like where you have more distributed generation, so you have more generation at that other end of the line, for example, right? Or more microgrid systems where you've got, it's almost becomes sort of like like the internet, right? The internet doesn't live in any one place. You've just got all these different nodes, and if you take out one part of the internet, you can't take down the whole system that I know of. You really can't. You can just impact some part of it. And if you have microgrids, these sort of autonomous islands that then overlap but have local generation, you might still take out power to some areas, but it won't propagate as far as it does with some of these outages that we've seen in these areas that really rely on large generation sources and users at some distance from those generation sources. So happens in Alaska too. In fact, maybe more so, right? We have lots of things that can go wrong in Alaska, and potentially that's even more predictable up here. And so we have traditionally had issues with a reliable power supply in Alaska, both on the rail belt and in rural Alaska. And what that has done is it has caused us to really invest in a more resilient power grid. We have a much more resilient grid. That doesn't mean that we don't have outages, right? But we have a grid that is less interdependent from one area to another. So if you have a catastrophe in one place, it doesn't necessarily propagate beyond that local disruption. And that's because of the way that we've sort of set up our grid. And that is around microgrids. So some of you have heard me say this before, but Alaska's grid, to the extent that we even have one, is microgrids all the time, okay, everywhere. We have nothing that's not a microgrid. The way that that's described or defined by like the Department of Energy, which is an area that has interconnected loads and generation sources that can isolate or island from a larger grid network, right? Our rural communities are microgrids all the time, every day. That's their operating paradigm. But even on the rail belt, we have all of these different microgrids that are interconnected and nested. So like, for example, in Fairbanks, where I am, if the UAF power grid goes down, it's not going to knock off the lights in Fairbanks. Or conversely, if Fairbanks goes down, UAF, the lights are going to stay on, right? And so we kind of have that situation. If there's a disruption in Anchorage area, Fairbanks is going to keep the lights on, even though we have an intertie that we rely on for the cheapest power that we have in the Fairbanks area. And that's why we have, like, for example, in the Fairbanks area, we invested in a 40 megawatt or 27 megawatt, depending on how you count the megawatts, size battery system up there, which it sounds big. It's hard to put that in perspective, but at the time it was constructed over a decade ago, it was the largest battery storage system installed anywhere in the world. And we did that in Fairbanks because we had this issue with power disruption from Anchorage, basically, right? So we're prepared for those things because they happen, and we don't, you know, we try to ward against those, but it does happen. You know, an example is with the Kenai Peninsula, with the Swan Lake fire, right? That took out a transmission linkage. That was a bummer because we weren't able to get power from Bradley Lake up to the rest of the rail belt, but it didn't knock anyone's lights out. It just caused increased costs, right, associated with that. So, you know, here's rural Alaska, and we have a lot of renewables that we have invested in across the state, more so than pretty much any other place, which is kind of a cool thing. And that kind of goes into, like, sort of where I wanted to end today, Marianne. Alaska has by far the most of these microgrids of anywhere else in the country, both by individual number, but also by installed capacity once you start including the rail belt in those numbers, which is a larger, you know, series of interconnected microgrids. And microgrids are one strategy, along with distributed generation, which are sort of inherently a component often of microgrids, to really addressing this resilient issue, right? This resiliency issue. And so if you have more of these interlinked small grids, you will have a more resilient electric grid system, even if it is higher cost, right? And so the question kind of comes down to, I bet Texans resilient power grid today compared to maybe, you know, a year ago, where they would have said, I'd prefer to pay 1 or 2 cents less for power, right? And so that's sort of like that question about resilience. It's going to cost more to reinvent our electric grid to be more flexible and able to deal with things like beneficial electrification, some of these like unexpected and things that you can't really plan for sort of events sometimes. Some you can, some you can't so much. And so Alaska's actually done something pretty cool in this technology space. It's kind of like in Africa, landline adoption never happened on a very broad continental sort of level. People went straight from having no phone to having cell phones, right? And in Alaska, we've sort of done a similar thing. Like, we leapfrogged the technology, right? We're a little bit ahead in some ways of where the rest of the country is, because we have invested in microgrids, because it's the only way that we can do business up here, given our distributed small population and large geographic area. So, you know, right now we are kind of the leader worldwide in this area. It's expected to grow a lot. And I'm also interested from sort of an economic standpoint on how we can kind of capitalize on our first mover advantage technology space, right? So that's something that we're working on. We're working with the utility industry right now. We've developed this nonprofit group called the Alaska Microgrid Group, which is really about sort of this idea of exporting and trying to monetize, to some extent, Alaskan expertise to help support development of similar sorts of microgrids in other markets, right? So this is something that we're working closely with the Alaska Village Electric Cooperative on, Kotzebue Electric Association, Kodiak Electric Association, Cordova Electric Association, kind of like the folks that are really at the forefront of this technology space in Alaska, really with this idea of thinking about how we can sort of export expertise and knowledge from Alaska, which is good to make sure that other projects benefit from some of our lessons learned, but it also provides to our industry here in Alaska, and make sure that we're still staying at the forefront by seeing like the evolution of systems in other places and understanding where there's these opportunities for us to continue to evolve and grow in the strategies that we're using in Alaska. So here's sort of ACEP's vision for Alaska in the future, that we are leading the way in the production, distribution, and management of energy. And that is all I have. I do encourage you guys to go to our website and either sign up for our newsletter, or there's just a lot of material on there if folks have other things that they want to dive into a little further.
Great. Marianne, do you want to start off?
Oh, sure. Gwen, first of all, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. You certainly captured the essence of the energy issues here in Alaska. I love the description of the microgrid. I'm so pleased to hear you're working with folks like Mira Kohler and Alaska Village Electric Co-op. I mean, they're just, you know, they have had to come up with these innovative solutions separate and apart from kind of the gas South Central utilities, which kind of rely on, you know, that semi-interconnection between the entities. But what I wanted to ask you is, can you put on your forward-looking cap? We've heard, as a matter of fact, Isaac and myself were talking about hydrogen and some of the new projects that are out there on the horizon. You touched on small nuclear. 10 years from today, what is going to be a more robust component of our new technology for Frontier in Alaska?
Well, I mean, 10 years, like that might be a little too soon, I think, for microreactors. If you told me 30 years out, I'd say I could envision a lot of diesel generation in Alaska being replaced with microreactors, but not in 10 years. I think the big challenge there, you know, twofold, and I kind of touched on them, is number one, energy storage. It's still very expensive, but if we are able to bring down the cost and incorporate more storage, that is a way that allows us to quickly incorporate more renewable energy. You know, we have this small grid. Utilities like face these, you know, real vulnerabilities in terms of the ability to incorporate too much kind of variable renewable power. But if we can firm that up, that is something that I would really like to see, but that's not at the state level. That's more at sort of the national level, I think. These transmission interconnections, that's sort of, you know, again, sort of this thing about, well, if you take out power plants in one place and just depend on transmission lines, then you might increase your vulnerabilities in terms of that transmission line going out. So there's some pros and cons there, but if we're looking at reducing costs, definitely figuring out ways like this high voltage DC transmission or medium voltage DC interconnection, even to industrial loads, you know, which could really be anchor customers that could then be nodes to villages in a region or something like that. That's a big one. I didn't touch too much on the social science side of things, or, you know, but I do think, you know, AVAC as an example, and I think maybe Mira is even on here, I'm not sure, but they are pooling resources across a number of different communities. And one thing that Alaskans, we tend to be pretty fragmented, right? We have over 100 utilities in the state. And pooling resources between multiple communities, which is part of what we're trying to do with the Alaska Microgrid Group, between multiple utilities, can really help us reduce costs and make sure that we have a workforce that can work across projects. That's kind of a smaller thing, but I'd like to see more of that. We did a recent study on like how much AVAC actually saves its communities compared to communities that have independent utilities, and it's a much bigger difference than I expected. I think on a statewide basis, we estimated approaching $5 million a year. It's really significant, you know. So, you know, that's not in the billions, which we often think about with state budgets, but it's a big deal to individual communities and residences, right? So, yeah, I don't know. That's just a couple of ideas anyway.
Great. Well, I'm going to send an alert out because there's many knowledgeable people that are online with us today, and it would be foolish for me to sit here and pose all of the questions. So I'm going to call an audible to Isaac Vanderberg and Bernie Smith and possibly a few others online. If I do, please bring up your cameras and pose a question to Gwen. And I see Isaac already has his camera on, so I'm going to go to him first and ask Isaac. So Isaac, please.
I'm in the hot seat because I had my camera on here. Hi, Gwen. Good to see you. Great presentation.
Great to see you, Isaac.
I'm curious, Gwen, I've seen a presentation that you've done over the years on kind of how Iceland leveraged geothermal to really build an economic sector around their expertise and research, and then started building some small companies around that. And I'm curious, I don't know if you've updated that presentation, just to get kind of your current thoughts on how some of the leadership that you so eloquently talked about today in microgrids and distributed energy resources, the nonprofit that you've founded sounds interesting. Do you have other ideas for how that leadership can be, a real economic driver in the state and kind of help us, aid in our recovery, but also, build a future here?
Yeah, Isaac, you should be proud of me because I didn't mention Iceland one single time.
I know.
And that's like hard for me because I'm a huge fan of Iceland. It's a place, and I know a lot have probably visited there, are kind of familiar with it, but there's like 330,000 people there. It's smaller than Anchorage, right? And they are able to do these. What impresses me and what Isaac is kind of getting at is I love the way that they work really closely between research organizations like the university, and they have actually like a geotechnical nonprofit that has a lot of research competency in the geothermal space, and then the private companies, right? And they have the biggest geotechnical company in the world, this nonprofit called ESOR, and that's sort of what I've modeled this Alaska microgrid group off of, or what we have done, right? Because they have this pretty systematic approach. Like, we want to be the global experts in geothermal energy. We are going to own this market. And they're doing it by both building up expertise at home, deploying that abroad. And the rationale there is that they are able not only to bring monetary benefit back to Iceland, but they're able to make sure that they're keeping people in this industry employed consistently when they have kind of ups and downs of project development in Iceland itself. And they are big believers in value added everything, right? And so they are this super entrepreneurial society that has a startups. And there's this really cool synergy between the research community and nonprofits and the government, and then the startup ecosystem that they're building. And I think, Isaac, you and I are big believers. For me, I work at the university. Oh boy, I should be careful who's on this call now, but I can't see anybody. But I don't work at the university just because I need a job at the university. I want to see our university be part of state solutions, right? How can we contribute to the private sector? How can we, Isaac, help your companies be successful? How can we push technology out so they become companies that participate in Launch Alaska and hire young, talented Alaskans to kind of be part of a global, technology revolution, right? And I think Iceland has done an amazing job at this, and we have a lot to learn from them. So I'll stop.
Hey, Gwen, I'm going to jump in to leverage off of that question and your answer. You've talked today about some things that you're doing through ACEP that are kind of open source. They're out there and available to the world. But can you talk about the continuum from pure research to applied research to commercialization, and how is the university approaching that, and how is ACEP involved in maybe creating a revenue stream to support ACEP in the future as these technologies are adopted, and perhaps helping to incentivize some of the commercialization that could be occurring?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked me that question. I could have pitched that to you if I was hey, can you ask me a specific question? That maybe would have been it. I was, up until a few months ago, wearing two hats at the university. I was also the director of the Office of Intellectual Property and Commercialization, and at UAF. And this is really where I worked. I've worked through both roles with Isaac quite a bit, both at ACEP and at YPC. I've stepped back from a leadership role with that, but I interested in seeing how the university can like move away from this area of basic research to more applied things, and then handing things off for commercialization in close partnership with the private sector. I think this is something that universities everywhere are sort of trying to move toward, right? More direct societal relevance, right? That doesn't mean that basic research isn't valuable, right? Because a lot of the things that ultimately become really important or like useful in our society started out through some sort of basic research where someone was like, wow, this is, you know, an interesting question that I want to answer. But we have been really trying to bridge that gap, like between some of the more basic research that's being done at the university and finding like really practical applications for that. And this is where, like with ACEP, you know, we've been really like looking at sort of these processes where we can get researchers to think more innovatively, right? Quicker about who sort of the commercial partner might be earlier on, right? So as they're doing their research, think about what commercial opportunities exist. And it's not a dirty word. Like sometimes university researchers are so altruistic, right? You just want to like, you know, slap them a little bit and just say, you know, commercialization is not like a bad, evil thing, right? And often that's actually the way you're going to get your product or your idea into broader use in society is by finding a commercialization partner. Like if you just publish your results and just put a paper out there, then all of a sudden there's no intellectual property associated with that anymore. And you're not going to be able to get that out to as many customers as you might want to reach that don't have the ability to actually read that paper and then figure it out on their own, right? So I think this is someplace where I'd like to see the university become a more innovative place in general, not just looking at basic research, but really thinking about that whole pipeline of commercialization and the role that we play. But I will say we just had a meeting yesterday and we just looked at all the research that's done at the university. And there's $140 million a year that's expended research at the university, almost entirely for external grants and grants, right? And of that research, is actually working on Alaska relevant things. You know, we're not doing research at UAF or at UAA that's only relevant to some other place. Like we are heavily invested in place-based research that's focused on Alaska and Arctic issues and maybe other, you know, relevant partners in other places and connecting us to those, right? So, but yeah, and that's where I'd really love to partner with some more of you guys is on trying to figure out how the university can really evolve and change in the role that we're playing in the state, because we're sort of, the university is sort of the only game in town when it's really a significant research enterprise occurring in Alaska, right? So we need our university to play that role and to do well and effectively, and partnerships with each of you is really how we get there.
Great. Thank you, Gwen. We're approaching the 1 o'clock hour, and with your indulgence, we have some other questions if you want to stay on. I know for our participants, if you can't stay on with us, we will record this and post it later. So don't feel like you're going to be missing out on anything. So with that, let me ask Bernie Carl. Bernie, do you have a question that you'd like to pose to Gwen? You can unmute and do that now. Did I say Bernie Carl? I meant Bernie Smith.
I was wondering, I didn't know that Bernie Carl was on there. I have been called his twin at times back in the day. It is good to see you, Gwen. I'd like to follow up on Isaac's point a little bit more on this geothermal. I know that you've been involved in that for decades. And, you know, at Accutan, a person who was involved with it was Starkey Wilson, and he really wanted to put a geothermal plant there for the Accutan fishery cannery, but also use hydrogen to put a little port out there to have hydrogen for the shipping. And I know that you've been talking about hydrogen, and I understand that it's still a little expensive, but if you're looking at your 10-year future, do you see anything like that that could be possible to get the cost down that geothermal could play in producing hydrogen, especially for shipping? Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I know people get pretty excited about hydrogen, and we actually, when I was at Chena Hot Springs, we actually did produce hydrogen from the geothermal power plant there, from excess geothermal. And what I wanted, and this is maybe a limitation of mine, Bernie, I will admit, like, I am a pretty practical engineering minded person. So like, I want economic solutions, right? Like you can do anything you want to with hydrogen. It's just, is it economic, right? Does it make sense from a cost standpoint? So what we did then is we mixed the hydrogen with propane so that the mixed gas acted, from a safety standpoint, was heavier than air. It acted like propane. You could treat it like propane and use it like propane. And that's the way I was able to justify using hydrogen in a way that was actually economically feasible. And so we actually got an SBIR award, Isaac, for that work and the mixing panel that we developed for that. But another person I think I saw on here that I don't know is still here is David Lockhart. About this quite a bit over the years. David's, I think most of you know, with Alaska Energy Authority. And we looked at like the potential of ammonia as an energy carrier, as an alternative to hydrogen, for example, because the big problem with hydrogen is that there's a lot of energy, but it's not very energy dense, right? You have to smush it all into a really small space or figure out some other way. That's what the high cost related to hydrogen is. It's really like, how do you convert that, or how do you store it without having like really exorbitant costs associated with that, like either compressing it or having really large, storage facilities. Whereas like ammonia, that lends itself much better to like liquefaction and stuff like that. And so, I think hydrogen, there may be some solutions there, and I'm especially interested in things like carbon nanotubes, where you might be able to store it in a denser form. Right? There's new and different ways of thinking about how to store hydrogen state. And that would like be, I think the innovation that would have to happen there is like carbon nanotubes. How do you actually connect all these little hydrogen atoms to other, like very high surface area kind of structures, like with carbon nanotubes. And then you can like get that hydrogen back out at the other end, right? So that would be one option there. Probably more like around like transportation, hydrogen for that, But then I think like things like ammonia, it doesn't sound as sexy, right? Because we think of that as like a fertilizer, but that can be used as a fuel too. And that might be a more viable approach. I think when David and I did this little analysis, which was really just kind of back of the envelope, I think we said that it would be competitive at like $10 a gallon diesel fuel at that time. And we were looking at, maybe one of these geothermal resources for something like that. So I don't think you're wrong. And the Aleutians are in a fantastic area in terms of like the shipping, routes between North America and Asia. But it's difficult for me to see how you're going to develop anything out there without having like a baseload customer. Some of these resources we have in geothermal I love geothermal. I am the biggest fan of geothermal, but unfortunately our best geothermal resources are not co-located with any existing loads, and it is a real challenge. So, and there's reasons for that, right? But where geothermal is viable, I think that could be developed. Another emerging technology area is just enhanced or engineered geothermal systems, right? The earth is warm everywhere under our feet, right? So if we can extract that heat, kind of create an artificial heat exchanger with the subsurface and do that in a way that's economic, again, it comes back to drilling costs, these different, cost factors. That could be a really interesting and viable alternative over a much broader geographic area than traditional geothermal has been.
On the hydrogen.
Okay,
hang on.
Sorry,
hang on. Sorry, I'm not sure who's speaking right now.
Chris Dillon.
Okay, Chris, can you just hold off for just 1 second, please? Okay, hang on just a second. Okay, we've got some other questions in the feed, and I want to get to that, and I'll go back to audibles in just a little bit. So bear with us. Actually, David is online. David Lockhart is online with us, and he's submitted a question asking if you see a future for renewable diesel and having a role in the future of power generation in Alaska.
Yeah, that's something that I think the Alaska Energy Authority partially worked on. I mean, whether it's renewable diesel or synthetic fuels, which are different, types of things. I absolutely think so. I mean, that's again, like where we can be looking, and that's honestly, David, that's something that we have not explored as much. I know you have brought this up before, and I am not as familiar with it. I know that's something that there's a lot of excitement at the national level. Honestly, if you guys have things like this that we like to be as sort of the like little skunk works, the little research organization, give us your ideas, or if there's a company that you think has something innovative, send that our way, and we'll do a little bit of like, sleuthing and get you some information back. But it's good for us to sort of be knowledgeable about that, because most of you see stuff that we don't necessarily see. So that's not something that I've particularly familiar with, although I do know that that's something that is becoming more and more popular in the rest of the country.
Thank you. Another AEA alum is online with us, Jim Strandberg, and he's asking, what do you see as the technology issues present with Alaska electrical grids? What are you guys working on? And particularly with regard to energy storage, what do you see as the issues and the opportunities for new technologies?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of ideas that have been proposed, right? I mean, pumped hydro has been something that's come up recently, and pumped hydro can be a pretty efficient way to basically store energy in a way other than through an electric storage device, because a battery, you're always going to have a round trip efficiency loss associated with that, right? And that's a little bit less potentially with pumped hydro. Another big thing that we've worked on is just this idea of storing energy in a form of heat, right? Alaska has a huge heat demand in most of the state. And so if you're able to, instead of thinking about it as storing energy, so in the rest of the country, we try to store, let's say, solar that's produced during the day, and then kind of duck curve sort of thing, where you're sort of shifting that to higher use times, like in the evening or something like that. But in Alaska, we sort of have very good resources. And what we can do is, and are doing in lots of rural communities right now, is overproduce on renewables and then use excess power to turn on and off thermal devices, whether it's centralized at a hospital electric boiler in Kotzebue. So you're shunting a bunch of your excess wind power to a boiler. So you're not having to store it in a battery necessarily. You're basically putting it into a boiler system. You're storing it as heat. And the same thing like in individual residences or people's homes, where you can turn that on and off at the grid level versus having to store it electrically or chemically. And so there's like these different strategies that Alaska's really been pioneering that I get pretty excited about, because they're not necessarily the way people are thinking about things at the larger grid level. And I think there's some real interesting opportunities there. So storage is a really big and broad topic, and I would rather not think about it just as electrical storage. There's a lot of ways we can store and use energy.
Great. Lisa Braff is asking if ACEP or the Microgrid Association, if you guys have done any sort of cost benefit analysis comparing the microgrids and local energy production and distribution to mega projects like the Watana Susitna Dam project. Can you talk about what the terms of the economic terms of those kinds of comparisons, as well as reliability and resilience?
Yeah, we haven't done that, but I can just say that generally speaking, larger, centralized, bigger scale power generation of any sort is going to be lower cost than distributed solutions. Like that's just a general fact. That's why wind turbines are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And you're seeing these multi-megawatt and offshore wind turbines. As they get bigger, the economies of scale improve. That's why we have gigawatt nuclear power plants and why we don't have small reactors, right? It isn't really that the technology wasn't possible, 50, 60 years ago. It's that the economies of scale were better when you built a bigger power plant. And that is still I think that is almost universally true. So a large hydro is going to give you a better bang for your buck than a smaller hydro will in most cases. I don't want to say all, because there's also there's a lot of variables in that right? So I actually want to be pretty careful. But I think that what you do get is these more resilient grids if you have these distributed resources. And the problem is we don't have a really great way to price resilience. We haven't figured out how to put a value on that, right? Like I said, again, if you would have polled Texans about whether they were willing to pay 2 cents extra for a more resilient grid 2 weeks ago, they would have said no way. If you ask them today, I bet you they'd say absolutely, bring it on, right? So it's once you start to have these issues, that's when all of a sudden you value resilience, which again is different than reliability. It's about the ability to bring the lights back on due to an unexpected outage, not minimizing those outages themselves, right? And so distributed generation is going to be your most resilient paradigm, but it's going to cost more almost every single time. So that's a kind of a pro and a con, sort of equation that everyone sort of has to figure out the balance too.
Sure, great, thank you. Chris Dillon, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but I'm going to ask a follow-up to Gwen on this issue of resilience on behalf of my Texas relatives in Abilene and Amarillo and Lubbock, most of whom were fortunate under the recent circumstances. But along those lines, in terms of places like Puerto Rico or even the Eastern Seaboard, where we've seen major outages over longer periods of time, what kinds of responses are you seeing, or would you anticipate seeing in building in more, not only more consideration of risk, maybe a different risk regime, and the calculation for resilience? I have to believe that the Electrical Reliability Council in Texas is thinking it's kind of unfortunate that reliability is in their name, and maybe they'd have a different conversation with Texans right now. So how do you see utilities responding to that?
Yeah, I mean, and Puerto Rico is another perfect example. The reason why those outages, again, it was a resilience challenge, why those outages didn't just happen due to the hurricane, but they were of such long duration, is because the power plants were on one side of the island and the majority of the population was on the other side of the island, right? And there was a long transmission network kind of connecting transmission, those loads to those generation sites. And that's because people don't necessarily want to live right next to a big power plant, right? I mean, that's part of it, right? And so that's another really good example of, like, they had to rebuild that transmission system. That took time. Like, there's no way to go around that, really, and to avoid that. Puerto Rico is actually a pretty major partner of ours on a couple of our research grants. And the reason is because we are both striving to develop more resilient grids. One thing, though, that I think is interesting, and I know I've just kind of picked up on the Puerto Rico comment. One advantage and disadvantage we have in Alaska is that we have so many utilities, so many independent utilities. Puerto Rico is one, right? So they're the only game in town, and if they're not on board with something, you're dead in the water, pretty much, right? You've got to find solutions that they're going to support. Alaska, sometimes it is frustrating, and we often hear that it is not very cost effective to have 6 or 7 utilities on a rail belt grid and stuff like that, and there's more opportunity for economic dispatch. But one thing that it has given us is a more resilient grid, right? They all have their own local generation, and so an outage in one place is not necessarily going to propagate to another part of that system, right? So yeah, I don't know that I necessarily answered your question there, but
that's great. Thanks. Chris, do you want to open your microphone and ask your question?
There we go. I posted a link on the chat of where the Japanese are as of 2019 on hydrogen. In 2015, they announced that by 2050, half of their energy would come from hydrogen. And in that presentation, they are going all over the world except the United States as a source of hydrogen. And it's like Dutch Harbor, Mount Makushkin, Why are they shunning us? I just see it as a possible shift in the Alaska economy. For example, as you said, ammonia, if the gas line were built in addition to an LNG, that they build an ammonia plant or a liquid hydrogen plant and sequester the CO2, repressurizing Cook Inlet. It baffles me why the Japanese aren't considering Alaska as a source. When you look at their map, they're going all the way to the Middle East for natural gas. They're going to Australia for brown coal to reform it into hydrogen. I'm just seeing it as a possible economic game changer for the state, as well as if we get in that, then it becomes a source of energy for our state.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I think the comment I can make on that, because I'm not an economist, so some of those questions are really outside of my field. But what I can say is what Japan is doing is interesting. And again, this goes back to trade-offs, right? So does anyone want to guess what the cost of power in Japan is today? Does it? Isaac, you want to take a guess? No? Isaac's like, no way. It's 30 cents a kilowatt hour, okay? So that's 30. So yeah, it's 30 on average in Japan today. Okay, like don't quote me, right? I didn't look that up right now, but that's my recollection. It's very high. And so they're making these investments in alternatives, in particular because they've had these, challenges, or they've very intentionally as a society decided to move away from nuclear energy, right? And so, but their cost is very high. So in terms of like the idea of sourcing hydrogen or natural gas from Alaska, I have no idea. That is just not my area of expertise. But I do think it's interesting that they're choosing to move in that direction, and they're willing to pay a much higher price point for energy because they've made societal choices on what they want their energy mix to look like in the future. And I think that's fascinating, whether they're really trying to drive a hydrogen economy and then be an early adopter of or developer of technologies associated with that, I don't know. But they are definitely paying more money per kilowatt hour, which then impacts their industries, right? There are impacts on an economic basis to Japan, and it'll be interesting to see what they've done. Iceland has done the exact opposite, right? They have these long 3 cent a kilowatt hour contracts with industry to bring industry to Iceland. So if you were industry, would you rather work in Iceland or Japan, right? Where would you locate your plant if it's an energy intensive industry? So I'm just throwing these things out. These are not areas I'm an expert in, but those are, I think, choices that every society makes. And yeah, I would like to see Alaska be more part. I'll tell you what, Chris, I would like to see us do more with value added processing. So you mentioned ammonia production. I just don't want to see us exporting natural resources, raw materials, as much as I'd like to see us do more manufacturing and have more happening here where we're increasing the value before we're exporting our raw materials.
Thanks, Gwen. Isaac, I know you had a few other questions and kind of leverage off of what Gwen was just talking about in terms of creating the value add and jobs and export opportunities for Alaska. Maybe we can let some, if you want to ask one of those questions, then we'll have that be the last one for Gwen.
Sure. Hi, Gwen again. And by the way, I was just Googling the electricity prices in Japan as you were talking, and you're right on. The individual is 28 cents a kilowatt hour, and I think the business is 21 cents a kilowatt hour. So yeah. Another question here. I'm wondering, Gwen, how do you see potential job opportunities for folks in the state, especially people in the oil and gas industry who may be looking for other opportunities to stay in Alaska and to find employment here? This is, maybe a subset of the question I asked last time. There's a lot of folks wondering how microgrids and new energy projects might help us bridge this, you know, kind of painful economic period that we're in at the moment. Any ideas about you know, how to navigate that transition and help folks that you know, upskill into the industry?
Well, I mean, we work really closely with the electric utility industry, and I know that there's huge challenges there in terms of keeping people in Alaska. And so we're, to the extent that which we're investing in transitioning people to work in those industries that are already in Alaska and want to stay here, that's a good thing. And I think people don't think of the utility industry as this like really dynamic, exciting, like, you know, forward thinking place, but that's actually not true in Alaska. I think that Alaska utilities are some of the most innovative and willing to take risk utilities while looking out for their customer interests, you know, in that I've ever come across anywhere. So, you know, I think that's a place where we're really trying to channel a lot of our to kind of think about from a career standpoint. From my perspective, this idea that there's a ton of jobs in like installation or like O&M sort of areas, like in rural communities, I'm skeptical of that. Although at least in our rural communities, we're often seeing that people do a lot of like part-time jobs associated with maintenance of equipment and things like that. So it actually is like more jobs than you would think. It's just a lot of them are pretty specialized or you know, part-time sort of positions. Isaac, I'm going to just throw the ball back to you. Like, I, again, would like to argue that Alaskans are very innovative. We face unique challenges. We often are very capable of solving a lot of interesting problems. And I would like us to be a lot like Iceland is, where they are kind of like a startup mecca of the world. I'd like to see our young people really think about, like, in the energy space or some of these other areas where Alaska has like unique opportunities, to really think about like how we can encourage people to start their own businesses and grow those businesses here in Alaska and have Alaska be more part of, you know, the global economy, because this is a great place to raise kids, to stay, to build a career and a life. And with, you know, remote everything zooming around, and with the better the connectivity that we have now with broadband, if Starlink is coming online, longer as remote and isolated as Alaska maybe has been in the past. So I would like to see more Alaskans be part of Launch Alaska. I don't know how many Alaskan companies you've had, but it's just like a half dozen, right?
Yeah, we're desperate for more, but I would also just give a shout out to Center Ice and some of the research at UAF that went into a group called Aquaga, which has come through our company, yes, through our program recently, and they're a super exciting company that's using IP right out of the university, yes, and is raising around and hiring staff, and then another one is, you know, Ben, yep, Kelly, of course, with the Launch Company, who's, you know, in the middle of an acquisition right now, a former UAF engineering student, and worked for SpaceX and is now making, you know, rocket parts down in Ship Creek. So I didn't mean to ask a self-serving question, but I agree with you, is that we're on the same page with this kind of collaboration between startups and the university, and there's a real sector there that could add jobs. We also just learned yesterday that one of our companies from down south is looking for houses in Alaska now, to move his family, and I said no, like the housing market's, you know, too hot already, but still an exciting data point. So I agree with you wholeheartedly, Gwen.
Great. Well, thank you, Gwen. Thanks for staying on with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Bernie and Isaac and Chris and others that contributed questions today. We will have a recording of today's session posted and announced out to folks that registered for the session, and we'll include Gwen's slide deck along with that. Just a quick shout out that we do have a program next week on Wednesday on the Alaska seafood industry, and we'll have representatives from ASME, from harvester sector, from the processing sector. So please plan on joining us for that. And we have upcoming sessions on with the Energy Study Policy Group coming up as well. And I'm going to ask Aaron to speak about those real quickly. Aaron.
Absolutely. So next week we've got Lee Thiebert from Chugach Electric is going to talk about the merger, and also Bradley Lake Hydro. And then on the 12th, the following Friday, we'll have Julie Etsy and Chris Rose talk about the creation of the Rail Belt Reliability Organization. So we'll continue along those lines.
All right.
No pun intended.
All right, thanks, Aaron. All right, thanks everybody for sticking out with us. And again, thanks to Gwen for being with us today and for a little bit of extra time to answer some more questions. And with that, we're adjourned. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.